"This is a restricted area, sir. No clearance, no entry." The guard snapped, barely glancing at the elderly man in the faded uniform. Just another forgotten relic, standing in the wind, holding a wilting white lily like it still meant something. But Elliot Granger didn't argue. He didn't plead, didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped back, placed one hand behind his back, and stood there, motionless, waiting. Inside the gates, flags were raised, cameras clicked, ranks of officers stood at full attention for a 4-star general's funeral. And yet, as taps echoed in the distance, one man outside remained unseen, until a commanding figure halted the entire procession and began walking toward the gate. They thought Elliot didn't belong there, until a general saluted him before the whole nation. Before this is over, the weight of silence will be lifted, medals will mean less than memory, and the man who was once turned away will carry more than ashes. Hell carry honor itself. If you ever believe that dignity doesn't fade with age, keep watching. Comment honor if that word still holds meaning. And if your heart still salutes the quiet ones, those who served, were forgotten, then remember it. You already know where to stay. Elliot Granger was 78, though the way he walked, slow, deliberate, with his shoulders pulled back, hinted at a discipline that age alone could never erode. His hair, once jet black, now thinned and silvered, framed a face carved by time and silence. Deep lines sat beneath his eyes, but those eyes still held the clarity of someone who once scanned jungle tree lines for snipers. Every morning at exactly 6:30, Elliot brewed a single cup of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, placed it beside a dusty window, and sat quietly at a small oak table in his Tennessee cabin. Always the same mug, always the same seat, always facing east. He lived alone, surrounded by pine and silence, with only the faint hum of a distant radio playing old country ballads to remind him time was still passing. A folded American flag rested on the mantel. Beneath it, a faded photograph of 12 young men in camo, only 4 of whom were still alive. Elliot had served 3 tours in Southeast Asia, most of it buried under the veil of Phantom Unit, a recon force that officially didn't exist, yet bled like every other. Twice he was decorated for valor. Once he refused to accept it. The only medal he kept was a burn scar across his shoulder, a quiet reminder of Hill 46-T. People in town rarely asked about him. To the grocer, he was just the quiet old guy with the boots. To the bus driver, the vet who never talks. And yet, last Thursday, when he asked for a one-way ticket to Quantico, the young clerk hesitated, not because of the request, but because of the way Elliot said it. Like he wasn't planning to return. Like he had one final mission left. The ticket was stamped. The date set. And the wind that morning carried a silence deeper than usual. The sky above Quantico was a slate of soft gray, the kind that muted every sound and made even the wind seem reverent. A line of American flags lined the drive toward the cemetery gates, their fabric whispering as the breeze passed through. Inside, polished boots clicked along granite paths as high-ranking officers took their places beneath the ceremonial canopy. But just beyond the gate, standing half in shadow and half in morning light, Elliot Granger was stopped cold. "I'm sorry, sir," the young security officer repeated, his tone clipped. "Rehearsed. Private funeral. You're not on the list." Elliot blinked once, pale blue eyes steady. "I served with him," he said, voice low, nearly swallowed by the rustling trees. "I came to pay my respects." The sergeant looked him over, faded green jacket, worn boots, a single white lily cradled in weathered fingers, and shook his head. "Without credentials, we can't let you in." A woman nearby, clipboard in hand, heels on stone, glanced over and whispered something too low to hear. The guard stiffened. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to step back." And then, it happened. With practiced detachment, the sergeant reached for Elliot's arm, not roughly, but firm enough to draw eyes. In the movement, the lily slipped from his grasp and landed on the pavement. No one moved to pick it up. A few turned their heads away. A couple guests near the gate stepped aside, pretending not to see. The sound of distant bagpipes trembled through the air. And Elliot, without a word, knelt. Slowly, with aching knees and hands that had once carried wounded men across enemy fire, he retrieved the flower. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just stood, dusted his jacket, and stepped quietly to the side, outside the boundary, but still within sight. No one followed him. The ceremony began. Inside, medals glinted under cloudy light. A flag-draped casket rested atop a polished pedestal. Generals stood shoulder to shoulder. Civilians whispered about legacies and honors. And just beyond the iron bars, Elliot stood alone, lily trembling again in his fingers. But not everyone had missed him. From the rear column of officers, Colonel Dean Wexler had noticed the man in the faded jacket. He narrowed his eyes. That patch, Phantom Unit, Ghost Recon. The kind of insignia no one wore unless they'd earned it in places the military pretended never existed. Wexler leaned to General Victor Rawlins and murmured, "Sir, he's here." The general froze. And that's when everything stopped. There was a shift in the air, not loud, not sudden, but deep. A tension that crawled through the bones of every man in uniform, like the pressure dropped before a thunderclap. The gate that moments earlier had denied Elliot Granger now stood open, held not by the hands of a guard, but by the will of someone no one dared question. General Victor Rawlins had left the procession, left the podium, left every layer of ceremony behind. He was not being escorted. He did not wait for signal or permission. He simply walked, boots striking pavement like clock hammers, toward the man outside the fence. Every conversation ceased. Photographers lowered their lenses. Officers glanced at each other, uncertain if they were witnessing protocol or something far older, older than command, older than rank. A reverence not rehearsed, but remembered. Victor Rawlins stood tall, broad shoulders squared beneath the dark blue ceremonial coat, gold trim catching the gray morning light, a saber at his side, though he had no intention of drawing it. His jaw was still, locked like it had been since the war. His eyes, storm gray and unblinking, fell on Elliot, not with pity, but with memory. He stopped just beyond the threshold. No introduction, no speech. He raised his hand in one clean, practiced salute. Sharp, Darien, sir. Full. Not the kind given out of duty, but of debt. "Sergeant Granger," he said, voice heavy but level. "You've been expected." Elliot said nothing, but his spine straightened a fraction, as if the weight of being unseen had been lifted by 6 simple words. The general turned slightly, motioned once. A younger officer emerged from the rear column. A captain, early 40s, crisp uniform, but eyes lined with stories. He carried a polished wooden box in both hands, wrapped in the nation's flag. As he approached, not a single step echoed. Even the wind seemed to pause. The box was placed in Elliot's arms. "These are his," General Rawlins said quietly. "Marcus wanted to come home, but he asked that you carry him." Elliot stared at the box, hands trembling but sure. For a moment, time collapsed. Jungle mud, tracer fire, a whisper through a radio line. "We're hit. Outside the wire." He nodded once. And then, something unspoken passed between them. Because the veterans seated in the inner rows, those with silver hair and silent histories, began to rise. One by one. Without command. Without cue. Not for a general, but for a man whose name was never printed, but always remembered. And in that silence, with the ashes of a friend in his hands, and a nation finally watching, Elliot took one step forward. No one needed an introduction. Everyone knew what came next. Under the muted light of the canopy, with the casket waiting and the nation holding its breath, the silence cracked, not with thunder, but with presence. Captain Mason Vexley, the one who had mocked Elliot Granger at the gate, stepped forward now, as if nothing had changed. His uniform still sharp, his smirk still curled, but his posture betrayed a tremor. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected the general to walk away from ceremony. Hadn't expected the box of ashes to end up in Elliot's arm. And certainly hadn't expected to see Major Cole Granger, Elliot's son, standing between him and whatever false control he thought he had left. Cole didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. He stood motionless, his frame squared, his gaze locked, not a flicker of emotion, not a twitch of restraint, just stillness, deadly stillness. Vexley chuckled, brittle. "Didn't know they let ghosts walk in full dress," he said, nodding toward Elliot. "Guess the pity vote goes a long way these days." Still, Cole said nothing. He stepped forward once, closing the gap to 3 feet. Boots planted. Shoulders calm. Eyes like carved stone. "You think this little parade changes anything?" Vexley pressed, voice rising in mock bravado. But the cracks were showing. Too much spit. Too much blinking. "He's just an old man who wandered too close to a camera." Cole's hand moved, slow, precise. Not to his belt, not to a weapon, but to the inside of his coat. And what he drew out wasn't a gun, but a letter. One sealed in yellowing paper, weathered, signed in a hand that no one here could mistake. He didn't wave it. He simply held it out, 2 fingers gripping its corner. Steady, silent. "This," Cole said, voice like gravel and dusk, "is from General Marcus Connors, addressed to Sergeant Elliot Granger, to be delivered only at the grave." Every shoulder within earshot tensed. Vexley stopped grinning. Cole continued, his voice not louder, just heavier. "He carried your medals, while you carried your mouth." The captain's lips parted. No comeback came. The crowd had stilled completely now. The folding chairs might as well have been stone. Not a flag rustled. Not a bird called. Even the wind, which had stirred the trees all morning, fell silent. Cole stepped closer, barely inches now, and leaned in with a whisper only the 2 of them could hear. "We know what you said, what you did, and so will everyone else, once this service is done." He didn't raise his tone. Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked back toward the casket, toward his father, never looking back, never breaking rhythm. And behind him, Vexley didn't move, didn't speak, because something had changed. The smirk was gone, and in its place, a silence that sounded a lot like fear. The courtyard, once filled with ceremonial silence, had transformed into something heavier, an atmosphere no longer shaped by pageantry, but by judgment, as if every soul present now felt the weight of what they had just witnessed. Cole Granger didn't raise his voice, didn't command attention with anything more than presence and truth, and yet the letter he held, with its creases worn by time and emotion, cut deeper than any reprimand, louder than any shout. His voice, calm and steady, unfolded the words left behind by a man the nation had gathered to honor. "You saved my life and disappeared like it didn't matter," he read aloud, "but it mattered to me. You're the only debt I carried that no medal, no command, no ceremony could repay." There was no applause, no movement, only the sound of breath being held, collectively, involuntarily. And then came the second blow, delivered not with anger, but with evidence. A young lieutenant, clearly nervous, stepped forward with a phone clutched in trembling fingers. Cole gave the smallest nod, and the screen lit up. What played was brief, no more than 13 seconds, but it echoed like a drumbeat through the crowd. There was Captain Mason Vexley, hours earlier, caught on security footage at the front gate. His voice rang out clearly, unmistakably cruel. "This ain't your war anymore, old man." Then the shove. Sharp, deliberate, unjustified, and the sight of Elliot Granger stumbling back without a word, still holding that single white lily, its petals fluttering like dignity refusing to fall. The reaction rippled outward in slow motion. No one spoke. Vexley turned pale, his jaw twitching, his lips parting for words that refused to come. I didn't realize who he was. It wasn't like that. I was just... The excuses cracked before they formed, and no one looked him in the eye. Even the most sympathetic glances had turned into something else. Something harder, something ashamed. From the front row, the oldest member of Ghost Company slowly stood, removed his cap, and pressed it to his chest. One by one the others followed. They didn't look at Vexley. They looked at Elliot. And in that moment, something shifted that no command could stop. From the left flank of the formation, a silent figure emerged. A provost marshal in dress uniform, his expression unreadable, his steps measured like the ticking of a final clock. He approached Vexley without a word, stopped just behind him, and rested a single hand on the disgraced captain's shoulder. That was all it took. No cuffs, no announcement, no force. Just that gesture, witnessed by every camera, every officer, every child watching from the back row. Vexley flinched, nodded, and walked off without resistance. And as he passed the crowd, not one head turned to follow him. Not one soldier lifted a hand in courtesy. Not one officer acknowledged his exit. He was already forgotten. Meanwhile, the letter in Cole's hand had not moved. The urn in Elliot's arms had not shifted. And in the space left behind by silence, justice didn't shout. It stood still and let the truth speak for itself. For a moment after the military police led Vexley away, no one moved, not the officers, not the townspeople, not even the wind daring to rustle through the oak trees that lined the edge of the square. Elliot Granger remained seated, his back straight, his eyes steady on the flag still folded perfectly in his lap. He said nothing, asked for nothing. And yet, that silence, it was louder than any verdict, heavier than any accusation. Across the square, a woman in her 50s, Mary Trask, who had once served coffee to Elliot every morning but stopped when the rumors swirled, stepped forward. Her hand trembled as she held out a paper cup of hot black coffee, untouched, unsweetened, just the way he used to take it. She didn't speak, just placed it gently on the bench beside him. Her eyes glassy, her voice caught somewhere behind a guilt she hadn't known how to carry. He didn't look at her, but he gave the smallest nod, and she understood. He'd already forgiven her before she even arrived. To the right, a young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering, "Was he really a soldier?" The man, red-faced, couldn't answer. He had been there when Elliot was pushed, had watched from only a few steps away, and had done nothing. Now, his shoulders slumped. He walked toward Elliot, then stopped halfway, too ashamed to speak, and simply removed his cap and held it against his chest. A gesture without words, but Elliot felt it all the same. No one applauded. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. And yet something was shifting, subtle but deep, like thaw after a long winter. From doorways and sidewalks, townspeople stepped out, not as a crowd, but as individuals. A grocer wiping his hands on his apron, a mechanic with grease still under his nails, a teacher clutching her gradebook. One by one they approached Elliot, not to praise, not to perform, but to return. A scarf, a thank you, a tear. Some knelt, some bowed their heads. A few could only stand in silence and let the weight of their complicity speak for them. Cole Granger, still standing nearby, didn't interrupt. He just watched his father, this man who had endured more in 1 hour of humiliation than most men face in a lifetime, carry himself as if dignity wasn't something others could take away. Elliot didn't speak. He placed the coffee gently into his palm, felt its warmth, stared across the square at the American flag hanging half-mast, and whispered just loud enough for Cole to hear. "This town used to forget. Maybe now it remembers." And from that silence, a sound rose. Not noise, not applause, but footsteps, steady and slow, as more joined him on the bench, as more sat beside a man they once ignored. There were no speeches, no cameras, just presence, just reckoning, just the start of something old being made new again. The old diner on the corner of Crestwood and Pine didn't change overnight, but something in the air shifted the moment the dust settled. The cracked American flag that used to hang, faded and crooked near the bar, was now pressed smooth in a new frame, glass clean, colors bold. Below it, where neon beer signs once flickered, stood a modest walnut display case, no larger than a shoebox, housing a photo of Elliot Granger in uniform, younger, standing beside his unit, faces sun-drenched and proud, with a small brass plate that simply read, "Sergeant. Father." No press release announced it. No committee demanded it. The staff had put it up on a quiet Tuesday morning. A dishwasher named Rico had brought the frame, said it used to hold his late uncle's wedding photo. Another regular brought in the old flag from her attic, saying she didn't feel right keeping it folded anymore. It wasn't an apology, just a gesture. But somehow, that meant more. Elliot never spoke about what happened, never mentioned the funeral, never referenced a confrontation. When asked, he'd just give that same half-smile and sip his coffee like always, gaze steady out the diner window at nothing in particular. But people noticed. The air around him carried something different now. Not silence, but gravity. And slowly, stories began to bloom where his voice never reached. A local high school teacher named Mr. Wendell assigned his students a project, unheard stories of American service. One sophomore, Mia Delgado, interviewed her grandfather and ended up asking about Elliot. She made a short film, black and white, voiceover soft, featuring old photos, quiet music, a single quote, "Some men save the world and ask for no return." It went semi-viral on local forums, and the next week, 2 teenagers came into the diner, heads low, hands fumbling with a small bouquet of daisies. They didn't speak, just left the flowers beside the display case and walked out into the morning light. Even the mayor came by one morning, not with cameras or fanfare, but alone, in plain clothes. He ordered coffee, sat 3 stools away from Elliot, and when their eyes met, he simply said, "Thank you." Elliot gave a slow nod, no words, because none were needed. The whispers spread without effort. Veterans began dropping by. Old men with canes, younger ones with sleeves rolled to hide old ink. Some shook his hand. Others just sat nearby in silence, like the proximity was enough. And on the first Veterans Day after it all, someone taped a handwritten note to the door. "This table is reserved for Sergeant Elliot Granger." Some honors are quiet. Elliot didn't tear up. He didn't touch the note. He just pulled his chair back half an inch more than usual, the sun catching the corner of the frame above him as if memory itself had finally decided to stay. In the quietest booth of the diner, tucked away from the soft clatter of plates and the hum of morning chatter, Elliot Granger and his son, Cole, sat facing each other. Not as soldier and officer, not as legend and witness, but simply as father and son. With the years between them, resting like steam above 2 untouched cups of coffee. The window beside them spilled golden light across the table, warm and slow, casting long shadows that didn't move, as if time itself had chosen to pause, just for them. Cole didn't speak at first. He just stared at the swirl of cream in his cup, watching it dissolve like memory into something less defined. Elliot's hands remained still, palms flat against the table, eyes focused not on his son, but just beyond, on a crack in the wooden wall he'd once leaned against during quieter times, before everything had become noise. The space between them wasn't tense. It was full. Full of what wasn't said, what didn't need to be said. Then, with a voice low and steady, Cole broke the silence. "I used to think you were hard to reach. But maybe I was just too loud to hear you." The sentence didn't fall heavy. It drifted, found its place between them, and settled in. Elliot didn't smile. He didn't nod. But the way his shoulders softened, just slightly, was answer enough. From his coat pocket, Cole pulled out a small, weathered coin, a challenge coin from Elliot's last unit, and slid it across the table. "Thought you might want this back," he said. Elliot looked at it for a long time, the coin catching a glint of sunlight before he covered it with his hand, drawing it in slow, as if retrieving something more than metal. He didn't lift it. He just let his hand rest on it, the gesture saying more than any thanks ever could. The jukebox in the corner, untouched for years, let out a soft mechanical groan, and then, without warning, began to play an old tune from the 70s, something with steel guitars and quiet harmonies, something Elliot used to whistle under his breath while repairing gear. Cole noticed but said nothing. Elliot noticed but kept staring at the coin. Then, gently, Cole reached forward, not quick, not performative, and placed his hand on top of Elliot's. No squeeze, no grip, just contact, just a reminder. Elliot turned to look at him. Their eyes met, and neither man blinked. For a moment, the diner, the town, the war, the courtroom, everything else faded. A waitress walked by, paused when she saw them, and quietly refilled both cups without interrupting. Her hand trembled slightly, as if she too felt the weight of the moment. When she stepped away, Cole chuckled once, soft and breathless. "You ever gonna retire from being quiet?" Elliot lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and finally replied, "Maybe when the world learns to listen." No punchline, no handshake. But when they both stood, almost at the same time, their chairs made the same sound against the floor. They didn't hug. They didn't salute. But when they stepped out into the morning, side by side, boots hitting gravel in sync, it was clear. The space between them wasn't broken anymore. And as the sun rose higher behind them, casting two long shadows that overlapped at the edge of the street, they walked forward. Not in silence, but in peace. The story of Elliot Granger didn't end at the diner, and it didn't stay confined to those who were there that day. Like smoke from a slow-burning fire, it drifted into corners of the town that hadn't seen him in years. In a fourth-grade classroom just 3 blocks away, a teacher paused before her lesson on Veterans Day, and instead of reading from the textbook, she played a 5-minute video made by one of her former students, Mia Delgado, the girl who once left flowers at the diner. The screen lit up with still photographs, Elliot in uniform, Elliot at the counter, Elliot doing nothing, and yet saying everything. No narration, just silence, and at the end, one line on the screen. "We see you now." At the local barber shop, old men paused their games of dominoes when his name came up. A younger man, barely 20, folded his phone and asked, "Who was he?" And suddenly, the room softened. One of the barbers, who hadn't said much in years, pulled out a laminated clipping from the local paper, yellowed at the edges. "He didn't need to raise his voice to change people," he said. "He just waited long enough for us to listen." The story traveled further still. In the small Methodist church by the railroad tracks, Pastor Lewis wove Elliot's silence into a Sunday sermon. Not with grand declarations, but with a whisper. Sometimes God sends reminders not as thunder, but as steady hands and tired eyes. Teenagers who once rolled their eyes at flags began to straighten them. A group of high schoolers started a project restoring neglected veteran graves at the town cemetery, placing small wooden crosses by the names, including one at an empty plot. Just a marker that read, "For those who never asked to be remembered, but deserve it anyway." Elliot never spoke about the change. He didn't attend ceremonies, didn't give interviews. He still came to the diner, Same seat. Same black coffee. But when the mayor asked if the town could name the nearby walking trail after him, he only replied, "Name it after the ones who didn't make it back." Yet, people kept telling his story. A middle schooler wrote an essay titled, "What It Means to Be Quiet and Brave." A boy in a hoodie held the door for an older man at the bus station and whispered, "Thank you, sir." A small library exhibit went up. Photos, letters, and one pair of worn-down boots under glass. And in a quiet moment, just before the sun dipped behind the trees, a child walked past the diner with his father. He stopped, pointed to Elliot's photo in the window, and asked, "Is he still in there?" The father didn't answer. He just placed his hand gently on the boy's back and said, "He's everywhere now." And somewhere above them, the flag on the roof of the diner snapped once in the wind. Sharp, proud, and still rising. The diner fell quiet again, not because of tension, but because of reverence. Elliot Granger stood slowly, his back straight despite the years, one hand resting on the counter where his coffee sat untouched, the other adjusting the collar of his old field jacket, now freshly sewn at the shoulder. He didn't look around, didn't wait for applause. He simply looked out the window, toward the flag that now flew higher than ever before. Clean, untattered, catching the golden light like a flame refusing to die. A boy by the jukebox instinctively took off his cap on. A waitress placed a folded napkin gently beside his cup, her eyes wet but smiling. No music played. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. And when Elliot finally spoke, it was not to the room, but to himself. And yet somehow, to everyone. "All I ever wanted was for them to look each other in the eye again. That's enough." He walked toward the door, boots steady, shadow long. And as he crossed the threshold, no one moved, but one by one they rose. Some stories don't end with noise. They echo, soft, steady, through those willing to carry them. If this story made you feel something, leave a word below, honor. If you believe the quietest voices carry the deepest truths, stay with us. We tell these stories for those who still believe in dignity, memory, and each other.